Okay, so this is really our last lesson, and what we'll be talking about is, making sure that we can coerce our data, set our data to be the proper data type, which is oftentimes a lot of the work before you then select that data. So we'll see how we can do this in a Spark data frame. So we'll start as we normally do with creating our Spark session, and we're setting our app name to be Civ Complaints, which tells you a little bit about what kind of data set we'll be working with. And then I guess here we're just saying that Spark UI port. As we know, we can get to that by going here and then just click on Spark UI. One thing I maybe should point out is you can see this already has some jobs in there. If you want to kind of create a new session, the way you can do that is by doing, sorry, I'll do it down here, spark.stuff, okay? And sometimes I'll do that just so I can be clear as to what jobs have been run and what job corresponds to what. It just cleans things up a little bit. So you can see now I'm kind of starting from a fresh session. All right, so the first thing we can do is load our data. So I have my data in S3, and as we mentioned before, we'll read it first into pandas, and then we'll feed that data into a Spark data frame, right? So we'll create a new Spark data frame from this pandas data frame. And we can, from there, as we kind of know, we can look at the first couple of records by then doing this calling show. So let's just take a look at that. And we know that maybe we can clean this up a little bit if we do vertical equals true. So this looks a little better. One other thing I should point out is you can get a sense of the schema, right? These are tables by calling this print schema command. And here you can see these are the different columns, and we can see also the different data types associated with each one of them. So you can see they're all strings, which actually when you're working with data is not the best, because say you want to see what's greater than or less than, well, that really just makes sense numerically most of the time, not in terms of text data. So a lot of the work that we'll be doing in this lesson is trying to see how we can convert our data from strings to something else. So the main way that I know to do this is with this with column method. So let's start to explore that. Maybe we can start by selecting this randomized ID column and just take a look at it. You can see it does have, they're technically strings, but I guess they're numbers. And I think we can do some work with them. So let me show you. What we can do is to show you how how we can coerce our data, right? How we can change it and operate on a column and change all the data in a column. We can use this with column method, okay? And what we'll do is we'll create a new column. Let's just call it, I guess, new ID, or we'll just call it ID, from this original column, okay? So it would be nice if we could just say like randomized ID and work with it directly, but instead we need to use this column method, and we'll import that in a little bit. So the column method, this comes from Pyspark.sql.functions import column. All right, and now we can create a new column, ID, from this original column, but instead of it just being a copy, let's add to each of the digits. So here, if I show the first 5 rows, we get 1 through 5. This time, let's call this my updated DF. And now this time let's print the schema. So we'll see what results here. And you can see that we now have a new column, which is pretty cool. And it's of type double. So it seems like double is a kind of float. It just has more digits than a float in Pyspark. So, or it has the potential to have more digits. So now let's take a look at these two columns and we'll see what happened here. Actually do this right here. Do updated df.select, and we want to select those two columns. That's ID. Actually, we'll do randomized ID first. Randomized ID and ID, and then let's show maybe the first 5 records. Okay, so you can see what happened. The with column method started with created a new column called ID, and the way that it created that column was from the randomized ID column and applying an addition operator of 2 to each of the rows in there, so that now instead of a 1, this is a 3. Instead of a 2, it's a 4, and so on. Now in this case, what I did was I created a new column, right? And I did that by, because we had started with randomized ID, and I specified that I wanted a new column called ID. So all in all, right, we now kind of have this new column where we have both the randomized ID and this ID. If we wanted to say, replace this column, right? Like update it and coerce the data, but not create a new column. So let's say I wanted randomized ID to increment all the digits, let's say by like 10. What I can do is just keep the same name, all right? So now we'll start with complaints DF again. Remember, this has that randomized ID. It does not have anything about ID in it, right? Because we just read this in from my original data frame. And what we'll do is we'll set the randomized ID column to be the old randomized ID column plus 10. So this time, instead of starting with 1, I guess I'll start with 11. So let's see that. If I do select randomized ID.show 4, you see that? So this is why do we talk about this? Well, this is how we can coerce our data, right? So oftentimes, like, this is kind of a silly example, but what we'll want to do is coerce it to a different type, okay? So let's see that. Maybe we'll look at this CCRB received year, which I'm guessing is like the year that the complaint was received. So you can see these are all numbers, well, they look like numbers, right? The year 2000. But really, if you look at the D type, I guess I can't call it on a column, but I can call it data frame object has no attribute D type. I guess we need to use print schema. That's all right. So we can see that the CCRB really is a string. So let's try to change it to be an integer. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to use this with column method, right? So we have complaints df dot with column, and let's update this column received year. So we'll basically want to replace this column. So we're going to create a new, have this updated column CCRB received year, and we're creating it from the column using this column method, and that's also going to be CCRB received year. But now what we want to do is change the data from string to type integer. So we need to do the cast method, and then we want to pass through an instance of integer type. So this is coming from Pyspark.sql.types, I believe, import integer type, and we'll find out. And then that seems to have maybe worked. So let's look at CCRB. We'll actually call this my updated DF. I'll try to not reuse my variable names. So let's call like updated year DF. And now let's print the schema. This might make it a little easier. All right, look at that. So we started with CCRB of type string, and now we have CCRB of type integer. How did we do that? Remember, we used this with column method to coerce our data. So we're saying we want to start with this column, cast it into type integer, and then call it CCRB. So we're replacing the old column name, or replacing the old column with this new column, which is derived from CCRB, which was a string, casted as an integer. Okay? What's next? Now we can call coercedf.create or replace temp view. All right? And what that would do is essentially name this as a table that we can then query. So I'll show you what I mean. We saw this briefly in the first lesson, where I can call this my complaints. Okay. And now from here, I can use that Spark session and do spark.sql to say select all from complaints, limit 1.show, and it breaks. Table view, I just misspelled it one way or the other. Okay, and now say vertical equals true. So the point is that once we have properly coerced our data, then we can query it the way we want. So, we could say from complaints where year equals 2000, I guess. And this is an analytical database, so we shouldn't have to worry about SQL injection. And this is now selecting those with the year of 2000. Okay? So cool. So that's really it, right? You coerce the data. You understand how this, hopefully you're able to understand how this is working under the hood, right? This is performing a filter. And then you know that, all right, it's not going to actually call this unless you call your action. So you're using that knowledge of DataFrames to see how, of RDDs, to understand hopefully how this is working. And then finally, if you want to confirm this, you can always go to the Spark UI and see what's being performed, and now hopefully break down how this is working. Okay, or at least have a better idea of it. Okay, so that's it for Pyspark. These labs are fun to work with, so I do encourage you to take a look at them. Thanks, guys.